My name is Violet, and I'm 58 years old. As I sit here in my living room tonight flipping through my son's wedding album, I can't help but smile at the beautiful photos. Marcus looks so handsome in his tuxedo, and Stephanie was absolutely radiant in her flowing white gown. It was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, and in many ways, it was. But there's one moment from that day that I'll never forget. A moment when my new daughter-in-law stood up to give a toast that changed everything. I've been living with lupus for 2 years now, and I thought I was protecting my family by keeping the worst of it to myself. I never imagined that my silence would be used against me in such a cruel way. Before I share this story with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt misunderstood by someone close to you, and don't forget to subscribe because I have so many more stories to share. Now let me tell you about the toast that revealed more than just my illness. Let me tell you about my son Marcus. At 28, he's everything a mother could hope for. He works as a software engineer at a tech company downtown, and he has this gentle soul that reminds me so much of his father. Ever since my husband passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, Marcus and I have grown incredibly close. He calls me every Sunday, brings me groceries when I'm not feeling well, and always remembers my birthday with the most thoughtful gifts. 2 years ago, when the doctor diagnosed me with lupus, my world turned upside down. The fatigue was overwhelming. Some days I could barely get out of bed. My joints ached constantly, and I started losing my hair in clumps. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though. It was watching my reflection change day by day. The vibrant woman I'd always been was slowly fading away. I made a decision early on to keep the severity of my condition from Marcus. He was already grieving his father building his career and falling in love with Stephanie. The last thing I wanted was to become another burden in his life. So I learned to hide the worst days, to apply extra makeup to cover the rash that sometimes appeared on my cheeks, and to smile through the exhaustion. Stephanie came into our lives about a year before my diagnosis. She's 26, works in marketing for a prestigious firm, and comes from a wealthy family in the suburbs. The first time Marcus brought her home for dinner, I was struck by how polished she was. Everything about her seemed perfect: her sleek blonde hair, her designer clothes, her confident laugh. She was nothing like the girls Marcus had dated before, and I could see why he was smitten. At first I thought her interest in my health was genuine concern. She would ask how I was feeling, suggest vitamins I should try, and recommend her family's personal physician. But over time, her comments began to feel different. She would notice when I looked tired and point it out to Marcus. She would offer to help with tasks I'd always handled myself, making me feel incapable. When I started wearing scarves to cover my thinning hair, she would compliment them while mentioning how different my hair looked. During the months leading up to their engagement, I noticed Marcus becoming more protective of me, almost to the point of treating me like I was fragile. When I asked him about it, he would just say that Stephanie had mentioned I seemed tired lately. I began to suspect that their private conversations about me were more frequent than I realized. The engagement announcement came last spring. Marcus proposed to Stephanie at the same restaurant where his father and I had our first date. When they called to share the news, I cried tears of joy. But underneath my happiness was a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that Stephanie saw me as some kind of obstacle to overcome rather than a future mother-in-law to embrace. The wedding planning process revealed so much about the dynamics between Stephanie and me. She approached everything with military precision, creating spreadsheets and timelines that would make a corporate executive proud. At first, she included me in the planning discussions, asking for my input on flowers and music. I was thrilled to be part of creating their special day. But as the months progressed, I noticed subtle changes. When I offered to help with the wedding favors, Stephanie politely declined, saying I should save my energy. When I suggested my grandmother's pearl necklace as her something borrowed, she thanked me sweetly, but later chose her own family heirloom instead. Each rejection was delivered with such grace that I felt guilty for being disappointed. The dress shopping expedition was particularly revealing. Stephanie invited me to join her and her bridesmaids at an exclusive boutique downtown. I was honored to be included and spent hours getting ready, choosing my nicest outfit and applying extra concealer to hide the fatigue in my eyes. The day started beautifully. Stephanie looked stunning in every gown she tried, and her friends gushed appropriately over each option. But during our lunch break, I began to feel dizzy and had to excuse myself to the restroom. When I returned, I overheard Stephanie talking to her maid of honor about poor Marcus and how challenging it must be to have a mother with health issues. She noticed me approaching and quickly changed the subject, asking if I was feeling all right and suggesting I might want to go home early to rest. That evening, Marcus called me with concern in his voice. He said Stephanie had mentioned I'd seemed unwell during the shopping trip and wondered if I was hiding something serious from him. I assured him I was fine, just a little tired, but I could hear the worry in his voice. For the first time, I wondered if Stephanie's concern was entirely genuine or if there was something else motivating her attention to my health. The wedding rehearsal was another eye-opening experience. The ceremony was being held at an elegant resort about an hour outside the city. The setting was absolutely breathtaking, with gardens that overlooked a lake and a chapel that looked like something from a fairy tale. During the run-through, I felt a wave of dizziness during the processional and had to sit down in one of the front pews. Stephanie was at my side, immediately asking if I needed water or if someone should call a doctor. Her concern appeared so genuine that several guests commented on what a thoughtful daughter-in-law she would be. But later, when I was getting some fresh air on the terrace, I noticed her whispering intently with her bridesmaids, occasionally glancing in my direction. That night, Marcus stopped by my apartment unannounced. He looked troubled as he sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years. He asked me directly about my health, whether I was taking my medications, whether I was eating properly. His questions felt different, somehow more clinical, as if he was checking items off a list rather than having a natural conversation. I found myself measuring my words carefully, not wanting to lie, but also not wanting to confirm whatever concerns Stephanie had planted in his mind. When he finally left, I sat in my living room feeling more alone than I had since my husband died. My son, who had always been my closest confidant, suddenly felt like a stranger who was more worried about my limitations than interested in my well-being. The morning of the wedding arrived with brilliant sunshine and a gentle breeze. I woke up early, determined to look my absolute best for Marcus's special day. I spent extra time on my makeup, carefully concealing the rash that had flared up on my cheeks the night before. I chose a lavender dress that my husband had always said brought out my eyes, and I pinned on the brooch he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. Standing in front of my full-length mirror, I tried to see myself as others would. Yes, I was thinner than I used to be. Yes, my hair was noticeably less full, but I was still here, still fighting, still the woman who had raised Marcus and loved him unconditionally. I wasn't going to let lupus steal this day from either of us. I arrived at the resort early, hoping to help with any last-minute preparations. The venue was transformed into something magical, with white roses and baby's breath adorning every surface. String lights twinkled in the trees, and the chapel looked like a scene from a romantic movie. My heart swelled with pride, knowing that my son would begin his married life in such a beautiful setting. When I offered to help arrange the guest favors, the wedding coordinator politely informed me that everything was under control. Stephanie had specifically requested that I be treated as an honored guest rather than a helper. While I appreciated the sentiment, it left me feeling useless and somewhat excluded from the final preparations. The other guests began arriving around noon. I was struck by how different Stephanie's family and friends looked from our side. They were impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and moved with the confidence that comes from privilege. Many of them seemed surprised to learn I was the groom's mother, as if they'd expected someone different. Their questions about my health were politely phrased but persistent, and I began to feel like my medical condition was the most interesting thing about me. During the ceremony, I sat in the front row watching my son pledge his love to the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. Marcus looked handsome and nervous, fidgeting with his cufflinks the way he had as a little boy when he was excited about something. When Stephanie walked down the aisle, she was absolutely radiant, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe I'd been wrong about her intentions. But even during that sacred moment, I noticed things that troubled me. Marcus kept glancing at me with what looked like concern rather than joy. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, several of Stephanie's relatives actually turned to look at me as if expecting some kind of dramatic intervention. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace overlooking the lake. I mingled as best I could, but conversations felt stilted and uncomfortable. People would start talking to me normally, then remember something they'd heard about my health and shift into that overly gentle tone people use with the sick or elderly. I found myself making excuses to step away from groups seeking quiet corners where I could catch my breath and gather my strength. During dinner, I was seated at the family table near the head table where Marcus and Stephanie sat with their wedding party. The food was exquisite, but I found it difficult to eat with so many eyes on me. Every time I paused to rest or took a sip of water, someone would lean over to ask if I was all right. The attention was suffocating, and I began to suspect that Stephanie had shared more details about my condition than I was comfortable with. After the main course, the DJ announced that it was time for toasts. Marcus's best friend spoke first, sharing funny stories about their college adventures. Then Stephanie's maid of honor gave a sweet speech about friendship and finding true love. The atmosphere in the room was warm and celebratory, filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. When Stephanie stood up to give her own toast, the room fell into an expectant hush. She looked absolutely stunning in her wedding gown, holding her champagne flute with elegant poise. Her smile was radiant as she began speaking, thanking everyone for being part of their special day. "I want to thank both of our families for raising us to be the people we are today," she began, her voice carrying beautifully across the room. "Marcus and I are so grateful for the love and support you've shown us." The guests murmured their agreement, and I felt my heart warming despite my earlier concerns. She continued with gracious words about her own parents, thanking them for their guidance and support. Then she turned her attention to our side of the family, acknowledging Marcus's sister Sarah and expressing appreciation for welcoming her into our family. "And I want to especially thank my mother-in-law, Violet," she said, turning to look directly at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. I felt a flutter of hope in my chest, thinking that perhaps I'd misjudged her after all. "She's taught me so much about strength," Stephanie continued, her voice taking on a tone that made me slightly uncomfortable. "Watching her battle her illness has shown me what real perseverance looks like. Lupus is such a challenging disease, and seeing how she faces each day with determination, despite her limitations, has been truly inspiring." The room had gone completely silent. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as I realized she was discussing my private medical information in front of nearly 100 guests. My hands began to tremble as I set down my champagne glass. Though she may not have the energy she once had, her spirit remains unbroken. Stephanie went on, her tone now, carrying what sounded almost like pity. "It's beautiful to see how she's adapted to her new normal, finding ways to contribute, even when her body doesn't cooperate." I glanced around the table and saw expressions of surprise and discomfort on the faces of our relatives. Marcus looked mortified, but seemed frozen in place, unable or unwilling to interrupt his new wife's speech. "And Marcus, you're so devoted to your mother," Stephanie said, turning to beam at her new husband. "Always worrying about her health, making sure she's not overexerting herself, being so understanding about her limitations. It's wonderful to see a son so concerned about his mother's well-being during such a difficult time." The final words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt exposed, humiliated, and utterly betrayed. This wasn't a toast celebrating love and family. This was a public announcement of my private struggles delivered with such false sweetness that it felt like being stabbed with a smile. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at me with the kind of pity usually reserved for wounded animals. I wanted to disappear, to flee from this nightmare that my son's wedding reception had become. But my legs felt weak, and I knew that standing up abruptly would only create more of a spectacle. Marcus reached over to squeeze my hand, but his touch felt more like an apology than comfort. In that moment, I realized that my son had been complicit in this public humiliation, whether intentionally or not. The woman he'd married had just used my illness as entertainment for their wedding guests, and he'd sat there and let it happen. I excused myself as gracefully as I could manage, telling the people at my table that I needed some fresh air. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way through the reception hall, past tables of guests who were now whispering among themselves, undoubtedly discussing what they'd just heard about my health condition. I found refuge in a quiet alcove near the resort's garden entrance, where elegant French doors opened onto a moonlit terrace. The cool evening air felt refreshing against my flushed cheeks, and I took deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart and gather my scattered thoughts. That's when Sarah found me. Marcus's younger sister had always been perceptive even as a child, and I could see the anger burning in her 25-year-old eyes as she approached me. Unlike Marcus, who had inherited his father's gentle, conflict-avoiding nature, Sarah had always been a fighter. "Mom, I am so sorry," she said immediately, using the name she'd called me since she was small. What Stephanie just did in there was absolutely unacceptable. I tried to brush it off, not wanting to create more drama on Marcus's wedding day. Maybe she meant well, sweetheart. Perhaps she was just trying to acknowledge what I've been going through. Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, Mom. I need to tell you something. I overheard Stephanie talking to her maid of honor earlier today before the ceremony. She said she wanted to make sure everyone understood what Marcus would be dealing with as your son. She called you a burden and said she needed to set expectations about your condition." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah continued, her voice growing more indignant with each revelation. "She's been planning this for weeks. She told her friends that she needed to establish boundaries early in the marriage, that Marcus was too soft-hearted to see how your illness was going to impact their future together." As Sarah shared more details of what she'd overheard, a picture began forming that was far worse than I'd imagined. Stephanie hadn't just used my illness for a public toast. She'd been systematically building a case against me, convincing my own son that I was more of a liability than a loving mother. "She told Marcus that you were hiding the severity of your condition from him," Sarah continued. "She said you were being selfish by not letting him know how much help you really needed. She convinced him that your independence was actually manipulation, that you were making him choose between his mother and his wife." I felt a cold anger beginning to replace the hurt and humiliation. This hadn't been a misguided attempt at inclusion or acknowledgement. This had been a calculated attack designed to position me as the obstacle to their marital happiness. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me a text conversation she'd screenshot earlier. "She's been discussing you in their wedding planning group chat. Look at this." The messages were even worse than I'd feared. Stephanie had been sharing details about my appearance, my energy levels, and my medical appointments. She'd turned my private struggles into gossip for her friends, painting me as a pathetic figure who was clinging too tightly to her son. "I have to do something about this," I said quietly, feeling a strength I hadn't experienced in months rising within me. Sarah nodded emphatically. "What do you need me to do?" For the first time since Stephanie's toast, I felt like myself again. Not the sick woman everyone seemed to see, but the mother who had raised 2 children alone after losing her husband, the woman who had built a career in teaching and touched hundreds of young lives, the fighter who was battling lupus with grace and determination. "I need you to help me get everyone's attention," I said. "It's time for me to give a toast of my own." We walked back into the reception hall together, Sarah's arm linked supportively through mine. The guests were still seated at their tables, many of them engaged in animated conversations that I suspected were about Stephanie's revelations regarding my health. The bride and groom were cutting their cake, posing for photos with bright smiles that seemed slightly strained. I approached the DJ station and politely asked for the microphone. The young man looked uncertain, glancing toward the head table where Marcus and Stephanie stood. But Sarah stepped forward with the confidence that came from being part of the wedding party. "Mrs. Thompson would like to thank everyone for being here tonight," Sarah said smoothly. "It's traditional for the groom's mother to offer a toast as well." The DJ handed me the microphone, and I felt its weight in my hands like a weapon I was finally ready to use. The conversations around the room gradually died down as guests noticed me standing at the front of the hall. Marcus looked up from the cake cutting with surprise and what might have been concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I hope you'll indulge me for just a few minutes while I share some thoughts about this beautiful celebration." The room fell completely silent. Stephanie had stopped smiling and was staring at me with what looked like barely concealed alarm. Marcus put down the cake knife and turned his full attention to me, his expression unreadable. "First, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate Marcus and Stephanie's marriage. Your presence here means the world to our families, and I know that your love and support will bless their union for years to come." I paused, taking a breath and letting my gaze sweep across the assembled guests. Many of them looked curious about what I might say next. Others seemed uncomfortable, probably anticipating another emotional revelation about my health. "I also want to address something that was mentioned in an earlier toast," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I have lupus. It's an autoimmune disease that affects different people in different ways. For me, it means some days are harder than others. It means I've had to learn new ways of taking care of myself and accepting help when I need it." Stephanie's face had gone pale beneath her professionally applied makeup. She was whispering something urgently to Marcus, but he seemed transfixed by my words. "What I want everyone to understand is that having lupus doesn't define who I am any more than having brown eyes or being 5 feet 6 inches tall defines me. I am still Marcus's mother. I am still a retired teacher who loved her career. I am still a woman who has built a full and meaningful life." The room was absolutely silent now, every guest hanging on my words. I could see some of Stephanie's relatives shifting uncomfortably, perhaps realizing that her earlier toast had been inappropriate. I chose to keep the details of my condition private, not because I was ashamed or trying to manipulate anyone, but because I wanted to protect the people I love from unnecessary worry. I wanted tonight to be about joy and celebration, not about my health challenges. Now I turned to look directly at Stephanie, my voice taking on a steelier edge. "I'm disappointed that my privacy wasn't respected. I'm hurt that my medical information was shared publicly without my consent. And I'm deeply troubled that my relationship with my son has been misrepresented to fit someone else's narrative about who I am and what I'm capable of." Marcus looked stricken, finally understanding what had really happened. Several guests were now staring at Stephanie with obvious disapproval. Her maid of honor looked mortified, probably realizing that she'd been party to something cruel. But most importantly, I concluded, I want my son to know that I will always support his happiness, even when the people he chooses to surround himself with don't show me the same courtesy. Marriage is about supporting each other through sickness and health, in good times and in difficult ones. I hope that lesson isn't lost in tonight's festivities. I set the microphone down and walked back to my table with as much dignity as I could muster. The room remained silent for several long seconds before scattered applause began growing louder as more guests joined in. The immediate aftermath of my speech was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Several guests approached my table to express their support, telling me how inappropriate they'd found Stephanie's earlier comments. Marcus's great-aunt Helen, a formidable woman in her 80s, made a point of loudly declaring that, in her day, a lady never discussed someone else's private affairs in public. But watching Marcus and Stephanie at the head table was painful. My son looked confused and ashamed, probably realizing for the first time how his new wife had manipulated the situation. Stephanie appeared to be in damage control mode, smiling brightly and trying to redirect attention back to their cake cutting, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Within 30 minutes of my speech, Stephanie claimed to have a sudden headache and insisted they needed to leave for their hotel suite. The reception was supposed to continue for several more hours, but the bride's abrupt departure effectively ended the celebration. Guests began gathering their belongings and saying their goodbyes, many of them stopping by my table to offer hugs and words of encouragement. Marcus approached me just before they left, his face a mixture of regret and confusion. "Mom, I need to talk to you when we get back from our honeymoon," he said quietly. "I think I've misunderstood some things." I hugged my son tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and remembering all the times I'd comforted him through childhood disappointments. "I love you, Marcus. That will never change no matter what." The weeks following the wedding were difficult. Marcus and Stephanie went on their honeymoon to Italy, and I used the time to reflect on everything that had happened. I realized that I'd been so focused on protecting my family from my illness that I'd inadvertently made myself vulnerable to someone who saw my condition as a weakness to be exploited. I decided to take control of my narrative. I reached out to a support group for people with autoimmune diseases and began attending their weekly meetings. For the first time since my diagnosis, I was surrounded by people who understood the daily challenges of living with an unpredictable illness without treating me like a victim. Through the support group, I met Linda, a 62-year-old retired nurse who had been living with rheumatoid arthritis for over a decade. She became not just a friend, but a mentor, teaching me how to advocate for myself and set boundaries with people who wanted to define me by my limitations. When Marcus returned from his honeymoon, he called to ask if he could come over alone. We sat in my living room, the same space where we'd shared so many conversations over the years, and had the most honest discussion we'd had in months. He apologized for allowing Stephanie to share my private information and admitted that he'd been influenced by her perspective on my condition. "She convinced me that you were suffering more than you were letting on," he said. "She said she was worried about you and that I needed to be more involved in your medical care." I explained to him why I'd chosen to handle my illness privately and how Stephanie's public revelation had felt like a violation of my autonomy. We talked about the difference between being supportive and being controlling, between caring for someone and treating them as incapable. Marcus revealed that his marriage was already showing signs of strain. Stephanie was frustrated that their honeymoon conversations had been dominated by discussions about family dynamics rather than their future together. She felt that I had upstaged her on her wedding day and was demanding that Marcus choose between his loyalty to his wife and his relationship with his mother. 6 months after the wedding, Marcus called to tell me that he and Stephanie had separated. While I felt sad for my son's pain, I couldn't help but feel relieved that he was beginning to see his wife's true character. They attempted counseling, but it became clear that their fundamental values about family and respect were incompatible. During this difficult period, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Marcus based on honest communication and mutual respect. I shared more about my daily experience with lupus, helping him understand when I needed support and when I needed independence. He learned to ask how he could help rather than assuming what I needed. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. While Marcus was heartbroken about the failure of his marriage, he told me that he'd learned valuable lessons about the importance of choosing a partner who shared his values about family loyalty and respect for others. Today, 2 years after that painful wedding reception, Marcus and I have a stronger relationship than ever. He's dating someone new, a kind woman named Jennifer, who treats me as an individual rather than a collection of symptoms. When she learned about my lupus, she asked thoughtful questions about how the condition affects me and what she could do to be supportive without being intrusive. I've also found new purpose through my advocacy work with the autoimmune disease community. I speak regularly at newly diagnosed support groups, sharing my story about the importance of maintaining your identity beyond your illness and not allowing others to use your vulnerability against you. The greatest lesson I learned from that devastating toast at my son's wedding is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. Standing up for myself that night wasn't just about defending my dignity. It was about teaching my son that respect and kindness are non-negotiable values in any relationship. Looking back, I realized that Stephanie actually did me a favor by revealing her true nature so clearly. If she had continued her subtle, undermining tactics, it might have taken years to understand the damage she was causing to my relationship with Marcus. Her public cruelty forced a reckoning that ultimately strengthened our family bonds. And sometimes the most important wedding vow isn't the one spoken at the altar, but the one we make to ourselves to never let anyone diminish our worth, no matter how they try to use our vulnerabilities against us. That's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life, lupus and all. What would you have done if someone used your private struggles against you in such a public way? Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who was trying to manipulate your relationships? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear about the importance of standing up for yourself. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in life's most challenging moments. Thank you for listening, and remember that your worth isn't defined by your struggles, but by how you choose to face them with dignity and courage.